Okay, so welcome everybody to this morning's Brown Bag Live discussion, Top 10 Myths About the Middle Ages. I'm Kristen, and joining me is Amy, and we'll be your Brown Bag host today. And I would like to introduce today's presenter, Jeri Westerson. Jeri is a Los Angeles native and the author of several books, including 13 medieval noir books featuring former Knight Crispin Guest. And they're awesome. I've read them all. She has also two other series, a paranormal series starting with the Book of the Hidden, and a new steampunk series starting with The Demon Device. Now, her books have won tons of awards, including the Agatha and the Seamus Awards, and have gotten rave reviews from places like Kirkus, the Historical Novel Society, and Library Journal. She has some really fun information to talk to us about today regarding the Middle Ages and what we thought we knew about them. So I'll go ahead and just turn it over to you, Jeri.
Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for coming from all the different places you are. So that's kind of exciting. I want to talk about the top 10 myths about the Middle Ages because even before I started writing my medieval noir series, I was a big fan of medieval history, particularly English history. And I started to notice that there were lots of misconceptions about this time period. It's a time period about 1,000 years between 500 CE and 1500. So it's a span of quite a few years. And this thing went around the internet for a while about they labeled all these things of where these ideas and these words and these phrases came from, and they were all wrong. Every bit of them. So I decided, hey, I need to do some presentations, and one of them could be about the myths that we have about the Middle Ages. And I'm sure that we all, even I, came to this thinking certain things were true, that we knew to be true, but actually I researched it, and I know that they're wrong. So let's begin. Let's just head on to the beginning. So, one of the myths, these are in no particular order, by the way, that people didn't bathe. Now, this just isn't true. Now, many didn't have indoor plumbing. They did have, some people, very wealthy people, had indoor plumbing with cisterns on their roofs, but they bathed as well as they could. Your average person would probably have what we call a spit bath. And you might be familiar with that if you go camping. You'd warm up a little bit of water in a basin, you'd wash your face, your under your arms, some of the important parts, and move on with your day. But there's a whole city in England called Bath, you might remember. And that has been something very important to people in that area since Celtic times. It was always considered sort of a holy site. Now think about this. England is very cold, and suddenly you have hot water bubbling out of the ground. They're thinking, hallelujah, this is a holy spot. But the Romans, when they came, they said, oh, this is perfect. We've seen these things before, hot springs. And we're going to build these buildings and plumb them with lead pipes and have these public baths. And they did have public baths in the medieval times. Men and women could participate in them. But these particular pictures that I'm showing you now, those are at brothels. Brothels also had their public baths. You can see everybody's, they're all having a good time. They're having a little nosh. They're in their little, hot tubs there. You can also see in the very edges in the left-hand side and also the right-hand side, they're also having other activities that you could have in a brothel. But the whole idea of cleanliness was also ascribed to holiness. And, of course, the opposite is true, that dirt and filth was thought of as sin. So you did try to get yourself as clean as you could. If you were a wealthy person, you could afford your servants to heat hot water for you and put it in the bath. And of course, if you weren't, you did the spit baths, like I said. Washing hands before meals was an important custom. In fact, there are people in living memory who can remember the Saturday night bath. And you might remember that from old movies and things. But the Saturday night bath up until probably the early 20th century, it was a thing that when you had indoor plumbing, you didn't have a lot of hot water in your boiler. So you'd have your bath on Saturday night so you could be all clean to go to church, right? Cleanliness, holiness. So the father would get the first bath. This is the same water now. The wife would get the second. The older kids and on down to the littlest kid. So the littlest kid would get the nice cold bath with all the dirt in it. So think about that. That's lovely. But they did other things as well. They knew about bad smells and bad teeth. So they also did things to clean their mouths. They didn't invent, it's odd, they didn't invent toothbrushes. But they had ways to clean your mouth. Now, first you would rinse your mouth out, and then you would chew on different herbs to sweeten the breath. Fennel, lovage, and parsley were those things that they chose. And then you'd rinse your mouth again with white wine, and you take a white cloth, this is important, a white cloth, and you would actually scrub your teeth with that, and then rinse it again with white wine. You know, this could become quite the evening ritual with all that white wine, but, you know, who's going to complain, right? Okay, so here's another myth, that meat was covered in sauces because it was rotten. Now, there's a view of a banquet, and these are very wealthy people. They're not going to eat rotten meat. They don't have to. They can eat the best meat. They can eat venison. They can eat things that were that the rest of the population weren't allowed to eat. So you wouldn't be covering your rotten meat in sauces, and I'll tell you why. First off, you can preserve meat in all kinds of ways. Salted, dried, vegetables and fruits were preserved just like we do today. They had dried foods like beans, barley, and oats. Lots of fresh fish and shellfish. You could keep rabbits, doves, chickens, of course, geese, ducks, wild fowl. Wild boar and venison were hunted right that day for the wealthier people. The common man would slaughter the family pig in the winter. They'd have the pig, they'd have piglets, so they'd have those growing, and they could slaughter the family pig, and they would use everything. The blood to make blood sausage, all kinds of stuff. You can use practically every part of the pig. And even in living memory, we have older butcher shops. This is my husband's mother's family. The fellow on the far right was his mother's grandfather, and this is his butcher shop in downtown Los Angeles. And if you look at it very carefully, you will see a couple of wires that are plugged into probably the lights and probably that ceiling fan. But if you also look carefully at the cases in front of them, those aren't refrigerated. And it gets pretty warm in LA, but they don't have ice and they don't have refrigeration, and there's meat hanging in the back because you bought it fresh. You bought it fresh. My mother used to tell me about when she lived in Los Angeles, and we were both born in Los Angeles. When she was a little girl, she would go with her mother to the kosher butcher shop, and she would play with the chickens in the backyard, and then they would choose a chicken, and the butcher would take it away and prepare it to be taken home. And that's how you got your food. That's how you got your meat. So a lot of these, the meats were fresh. Here's another view of the reasons why you wouldn't use rotten meat. Because the meat was far cheaper than the spices you're using to make your sauces. This represented, on what you see on this plate, hundreds of dollars today, if you would transfer the money from that time period to today. Hundreds of dollars for these spices. And you didn't use them willy-nilly. You had special prepared recipes for these things. They liked sauces. just like you like ketchup with your fries. Sauces were very important to the culinary palate of the people of that time period. And if, by the way, if you want to eat something that tastes medieval European, you should eat Moroccan food, because they use the same spices that they used in medieval Europe. There's a lot of things that you consider spices for baking, cinnamon, cardamom, and things like that for the meat sauces. So try Moroccan food, and as you're eating it, think, oh, this is a medieval table. This is the way they wanted to eat. So here you are using $50 worth of spices to save the flavor of $5 worth of meat. No, you wouldn't be doing that. Here are just an example. I don't know how well you can see this, but these are the trade routes throughout medieval Europe. And you can see the longer lines are going all the way to the Middle East and to India to buy spices. There was a lot of the trade there. These are the different countries, the things that they traded. In England, there was a lot of wool and tin. That was the stuff that they had. And here are some examples of preparing food. The guy on the left, of course, he's making meat pies. And he's got the meat just hanging there in the back. And he's making his pastry, and he's putting it in the oven. Here's a photo of a woman today in probably some heritage site that is a recreation of a medieval village. They used small containers to do lots of cooking. A lot of the cooking was done not just in metal containers, but the average person used a lot of ceramic. That is a ceramic pot she's cooking in. So now we're moving on to other some of the other myths, that the earth was flat. People thought the earth was flat. Even though we have some flat earthers cropping up nowadays, no one on the planet ever thought the earth was flat. Now, why is that? Seems kind of flat, but it's the evidence of your eyes. Have you ever gone on top of a hill and you can just see the vast plains in front of you? Well, you can kind of see a slight sort of curvature of the earth. And if you're standing on a pier and you're watching your ship with its masts disappearing below the horizon, you're not panicking and saying, hey, those guys, they're sinking, they're going on the other side of the planet, they're going off the edge of the earth. Now, you knew that they were going into the distance. You could tell that that's what was happening. I think that we've become a little complacent about the things that we can actually see with our own eyes, but that wasn't a problem with people of this time period and earlier. Look at the picture on the left. There's lots of paintings and done about Jesus and his family, and he is often portrayed holding an orb. Kings were anointed holding an orb. They're the stand-in for Jesus to protect all that they had in their realm, and Jesus has an orb that represents everything, the universe. He wasn't given a plate in these pictures. They are orbs. Everybody knew that. For instance, here's Roger Bacon from the 13th century. He says, quote, curvature of the earth explains why we see farther and at higher elevations. This is what I said. We have Thomas Aquinas from his Summa Theologica in the mid-1200s. It's in this treatise, the roundness of the earth is giving an obvious example of a well-known scientific proof. And he says, for the astronomer and the physicist both may prove the same conclusion, that the earth, for instance, is round. The astronomer by means of mathematics, i.e., abstracting from matter, and the physicist by means of matter itself. So where does this whole thing come from about the earth is flat? And Columbus, the fellow on the right, sailing the ocean blue the year 1492 to prove that the world was round. Well, that's not what he was doing. But we have Washington Irving to blame for that. Remember him? He's the guy that wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. Well, he wrote a biography of Christopher Columbus in 1828. And he made some of these claims in that autobiography, and particularly a scene where he has the church wants to charge heresy for anyone saying that the earth is round, when the church taught that it was flat. Now that's completely wrong, because the church never taught that, and that's not why Columbus was sailing the ocean blue. If you remember that map we saw earlier about the trade routes, Christopher Columbus was trying to discover a route to India so that they could get the spices more easily instead of spending a lot of money on these traders that came to them. Now, and that's why our Native Americans are called Indians, because when he arrived, he really wanted to believe he was in India. He knew he wasn't, but he really wanted to believe it. So the people that he met, he said, Indians. And they said, no, we're not Indians. Oh, yes, you are. This is India, and you're Indians. No, we're not. So that's sort of where that comes from. So let's not believe that anymore. All right. For some reason, a lot of people believe that there was this unbridled lawlessness throughout the Middle Ages. Pitchforked and torch-waving peasants in uprisings, unbridled thievery on the streets. Actually, it was pretty much the opposite. The courts were busy and efficient, and there were so many lawsuits. Now, you think we're a litigious society. The medievals, they sued everyone. They sued men, sued women, women sued men, rich sued poor, poor sued rich, everybody. And the wonderful thing about England is they kept documents of everything. They have rolls, and we have them today. Rolls and rolls of parchment of all of the suits and the criminal lawsuits and the criminal courts. Very busy. There are almost too many laws. They had a lot of them. And in fact, they had, this kind of goes back to the cleanliness thing. They had laws against you actually dumping your chamber pot out the window. I'm sure you've seen those imagery in movies, TV. But there were laws against that. Because, I mean, why would you do that in the first place? It's going to get all over the side of your own building. It's going to stink up the whole place. Not that the place didn't stink up, but they had to have laws against people doing that. They had laws against you if you owned two properties across the street from each other. You couldn't build a bridge unless you got permission, because that bridge might be too low for a guy on a horse. So there were lots of laws. We can thank Henry II of England from the 12th century, who invented the trial by a jury. Now, in those days, this was the jury of people who knew the accused. And if you think about it, in that time, it made sense. You have to think of London. London at that time period was about 3 miles square, with starting to trickle off into the other areas as well. People lived in close proximity. You couldn't build outward, so you built upward. That's why we have 2- and 3-story houses and shops in London. It was crammed to people. At its height in the Middle Ages, it had about 50,000 people, which was second only to Paris, who had a little bit more. But that's a lot of people crammed in a small area. So it was divided up into different parishes. There was a church on every corner, and that was your parish. So if a crime was committed, say person A was arguing with person B, and person A ended up dead, who killed him? Well, it seems likely it was person B. And the people that knew you could testify either to your good character that, no, that couldn't have been you, or yes, that's probably you. So it made sense, of course. Now, there was also the term outlaw. Yes, they did have outlaws, but you were only declared an outlaw when you failed to show up for trial for the first 3 times that you were called. So that was it for you. Now, jails, and they did have a few of them in London, were to keep you for the trial. Jails weren't used as punishment. Prisons weren't used as a punishment. It was just to hold you until they meted out the punishment. Now, this is Newgate. In the time period I write about, it is a gate in the walls around London. There was about 7 of these gates. They were to keep people out, keep enemies out, but they also were served as prisons sometimes. In many cities they were used that way, but this is Newgate. It doesn't exist anymore. It was around until, it was about the Victorian era. It's about the time it finally closed. But so it doesn't exist anymore, but it was very busy. As just an example of the sorts of cases that you had, and, was there really justice in this time period? Yes, there were lawyers and court cases and all that stuff. But in 200 cases of homicide between 1281 and 1290, only 21% of those were found guilty. Now, yes, there could be a little bit of bribery, but for the most part, they were very conscientious of making sure that justice was done. I mean, this was all part of their religious practices at that time. So there was several kinds of murder. This is also when they started to develop shades of murder, first degree, second degree, that sort of thing. In fact, if you study jurisprudence in the medieval time period, you will see that we in America got a lot of our jurisprudence laws and terms from this time period. Very interesting. So in the 12th century, there were 2 kinds of murder. One was murderum, the slaying done in secret, that would be first degree, and simplex homicidrum, killing that was not planned, something like self-defense or accidental. Because it was all about the intention. Sin is about intention, and so this was intention. Later, they added manslaughter. This is a slaying in hot blood in a duel, or perhaps you came home and you found your wife in bed with some other man and you killed him and or her. So that was manslaughter. That changed a little bit in the translation. But then there's always this as well. The cartoon says, "It's medieval times week here at the courthouse, so I'm afraid that instead of getting probation, you'll be drawn and quartered." Anyway, we're going to move on to chastity belts, everybody's favorite. So, chastity belts. No, they did not exist. If you think about it, it doesn't make any sense. There was the idea that a man going off to the Crusades, who was going to be gone for years, put his wife in some sort of crazy contraption like this. Well, as soon as he rode off into the distance, the wife would call in the local tinker, and he would get her out of it. And the kids would probably look like him. So this never happened. This is a Victorian myth. Now, God bless the Victorians, because they were fascinated by the Middle Ages. They just loved it. And if you could imagine those pre-Raphaelite paintings, they did a lot of those, a depiction of noble Dutch boy coiffed crusaders meeting their lady loves in sunlit groves, a veritable Rivendell of velvet gowns and pointy sleeves. They just loved that stuff. And they wrote a lot of books, because they were fascinated by the whole chivalrous life, the code of chivalry and courtly love, and they wrote a lot of books about it. Now, when you do research today, there's a lot of new information, so you can't always use just any old book for research. You really need to talk to scholars and medieval historians, and I have when I do my research, because they will tell you which are the best, most up-to-date books. But some of the Victorian books of the time period was just made up. It's just made up what they thought was medieval. Yet some are still very good. And I've had medieval scholars recommend to me some Victorian books who are the final arbiter of that particular thing that I was researching. And it's still valuable. So you do have to be careful. Now, this is Victorian. This, in fact, something like this is just a fake one, but a chastity belt was actually on display in the British Museum since 1846. And about, I think it's 15 years ago now, it was finally taken off display. And the reason is that the curators finally realized that it was a fake. It was a Victorian fake. 1846, that's probably when it was made. The spokesman from the British Museum, explaining why they were taking it out of their display, said, quote, "It is probable that the majority of existing examples were made in the 19th century as curiosities for the prurient or jokes for the tasteless." So other torture devices, by the way, like in the Iron Maiden, it's sort of like a Russian doll, only really big, and inside there's these spikes, and you put the person inside, and you crank and the spikes go deeper and deeper. That didn't exist. That's a hoax. The earliest account is of one of these Iron Maidens. If you see them on display somewhere, they're a hoax. The earliest account is from 1793 as a hoax. They understood that. And there's a lot of other devices of torture that we blame on the medievals, when actually those are Renaissance. So don't blame the medieval people. Okay, another myth. Off with his head. All these people getting their heads chopped off. Well, it was rare. It did happen. Mostly, when you were executed, you were hanged. Now, the problem with having a headsman who doesn't get to behead people very often is that they aren't very good at it. So, a human neck is not like a chicken neck. It's a lot bigger. The bones are a lot bigger. So you can sharpen that thing all you like, but if you haven't done it before, you're going to miss a lot. So it was really a dreadful thing to be beheaded, because it would probably take several chops to do it. And if you remember from Harry Potter, Nearly Headless Nick, he's nearly headless because there's just a little bit of skin holding his head on there. And that was a problem. They were very bad at it. So Anne Boleyn, when she was going to be executed by Henry VIII, she requested a French swordsman because they'd do a better job. Witch burning. Now, we thought that there was a lot of burning of witches, and we were talking about this earlier, but truly, no. Occasionally there was a true heretic which was burned, like Joan of Arc, but she was a special case. It was more a case of English versus French rather than person versus church. But witches, when they found them, they were usually hanged. Now these poor fellows here, though, that's Jacques de Molay, those are Templars getting their heretic burning. And now another myth, dark, as in Dark Ages, as in unenlightened. So they're all just waiting around for the Renaissance. Boy, I wish the Renaissance would come. I'm tired of being unenlightened. No historian ever calls it the Dark Ages. There are several terms that we should get straight. There's the early Middle Ages, what people call the Dark Ages. That's between 500 and 800 CE. There's the High Middle Ages, between 900 and 1100. And the Late Middle Ages, between 12 and 1500. Now, this is, again, a misnomer, probably coined by the Victorians, once again, refers to a cultural decline from the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, this term, Dark Ages, actually came from the Italian scholar Petrarch in the 1330s. It was intended as a sweeping criticism of late Latin literature, or lack of highbrow literature. So essentially, he had nothing to read, therefore these were the dark ages. It's like your kid clicking on the remote going, there's nothing on TV. So that's basically where we get that from. And the Victorians glommed onto that and regarded it as a time where there was limited activities, there was few material cultural achievements, a demographic decline, when that in fact was just not true. Here are some of the things that were invented during the medieval period. Clocks, mechanical clocks, geared clocks, musical notation. That started in the abbeys with monks because everybody's chanting a certain tune and they wanted it to be conforming to all the other monasteries, and so they invented this sort of musical notation. And there were other things invented as well. Toilet paper. Not like that, but in China, they invented toilet paper in 589. Didn't get to Europe till considerably later. Quill pen. Using a quill as a pen. Around the 700. Pharmacies and drugstores in 754 in Baghdad. In the Middle East, they had a lot of things that they were inventing, that and mathematics and all sorts of things. And pharmaceuticals were one of them. In 800, the spinning wheel was in India. It didn't get to Europe till hundreds of years later. In 1200, buttons and buttonholes, things that we take for granted that they didn't have. They pinned a lot of their clothes, or they sewed themselves into it. And imagine, in hooks and eyes, imagine somebody finally figuring out a button going, wow, what a great idea. Now, they hadn't come up with pockets yet. That was much later. But buttons and buttonholes really was a huge improvement in clothing. In the 12th century, China came up with, again, paper for writing on and block printing. And it wasn't until the 15th century that metal, movable type, and the printing press was invented in Europe. In 1200s, eyeglasses, and many more things. It wasn't a period of darkness, so get that out of your head. There's also the myth that people ate off pewter plates and threw bones on the floor. Well, pewter was still regulated to wealthy, not in wide use until around the 15th century. Instead, they ate off trenchers, which are bread baked for the purpose of being your plate. They were little rectangular pieces of bread, and you would put all your food on it, and it would soak up all the gravy and such. And if you were a pretty well-to-do, if you're a merchant or a wealthy household, you would give those plates of bread to an almoner, and you would pass it out to poor people who didn't have any food. But if you were very wealthy, you could have the pewter, of course. But you wouldn't be throwing your food on the floor, your bones on the floor. It wasn't a good idea then any more than it is now. Even if you had dogs walking around, you don't want the maggots and things from food on the floor. We get this notion from, and there he is on the left, the movie, The Private Life of Henry VIII from 1933. That's Charles Laughton playing Henry VIII. He would take a few bites of his food and toss it over his shoulder, and that, by God, that image stuck with people for some reason. In the medieval time period, table manners were very important. These people lived in very close society. When you were at court, particularly, everybody knew everybody's business. Everybody was together. But a meal time when we all came together was a very important thing. And in fact, in many homes, this was the same way. If you look at that picture on the right, you'll see below the table, those are trestle tables, and those are like sawhorses. And these were boards. These were temporary. When you didn't have a meal, these would be pushed, the board would be taken down, the sawhorse was pushed to the side of the house, of the wall, and you'd have this big space to do whatever else you were doing. But it was mealtime, you set up these boards. And by the way, that board for your table, that's where room and board comes from. The board meant getting food. So table manners, very important. Social graces. Everybody would wash their hands before the meal. You washed your hands because you ate with your hands. You didn't have forks yet. Forks were only for actually serving the food, not for eating the food. You ate with knives and spoons. And your hands. So don't wipe your mouth on your sleeve. What are you, some sort of barbarian? Use the tablecloth. What do you think that's for? The tablecloth was for wiping your hands and wiping your face because they didn't have napkins for each person yet. That was something they hadn't thought of. It was for the tablecloth. And very often, in big meals like this, you would share your cup with the person next to you because there wasn't enough of those things. So you would share the cup, so you always had to chew and swallow your food before you took a drink. That was the polite thing to do. So these are all very important to know when you're in this. So if you ever go back in time, be cool when you're at the table. And lastly, we have armor. Was too heavy. Well, no, it's not. If you go to my website, JeriWesterson.com, I'm sure you'll see a picture of me in full armor. Full harness is what that's called. The fellow on the left, he's wearing full harness. He can be from the 14th century on up, where they finally had full armor, plate armor. When you're in full harness like that, with a helm, with all the plate all over your body, it'll weigh anywhere from 60 to 120 pounds. This is important because it's expensive to be a knight, but think about this. If you were wearing 60 to 120 pounds in a backpack, yeah, that would be heavy. But you've got 60 to 120 pounds distributed all over your body. You had a hauberk, which is a mail shirt made out of mail, chest plates, arm plates. You had your sword. He's got a long sword. I have several broadswords, which are considerably smaller, about 3 pounds, 44 inches long. You had to be able to do everything in your armor. You had to be able to get on your horse. You had to be able to get off your horse. You had to be able to fight for long periods of time. You could like the guy on the right, you could do cartwheels in him. You can do all sorts of exercise in your armor. The only thing not recommended would be to swim, but you had to be able to do these things. And I know that we are familiar with this image of a knight being lowered onto his horse by some mechanical beings. And yes, Henry VIII was lowered onto his horse that way, but that was not because the armor was heavy. It was because he was fat. And when he got too fat, that's how he had to be put on his horse. So let's not think that armor is all that heavy, because it was not. So why do these myths persist? I suppose because they seem medieval. It seems to make sense that people thought the earth was flat. It seems to make sense that, well, they were trying to cover the horrible taste of their meat with sauces. But they're not. When you think about them, when you think about your life, would you do these things? Would it make sense to you? And if you lived with other people in such close proximity, what are the things you would do? You'd try to keep yourself clean and smelling good. Were they different from us? Not all that much. They really weren't. They had the same loves and desires and values as most of us. But they were different in the sense that everyone understood their place in society. There was a code of ethics. Family ties were incredibly important. They had a common belief system for the most part. So that did make things a little easier when you've got a big community that you need to sort of corral. But I'd much rather know the real history than repeat the myths, and I hope today that you will also correct people when they come up with some of these bizarre ideas, because you heard it here first, folks. So now I guess we're open for questions.
That was awesome. That was so Much fun. I was taking notes as I was listening to you because if nobody else has questions, I have a ton. But
Good.
but does anybody have any questions they want to type into the chat box so I don't totally commandeer? Erica's asking, what myths did you originally hold? Did you originally hold?
Did I really have of the Middle Ages? I think that I thought armor was too heavy, and that it was a dark age, that nobody was doing anything, they weren't learning anything. I think those are easy to believe when you don't delve deep enough. I think we all used to study more things, too, in school. I think that sometimes the textbooks aren't particularly as correct as they could be. I remember when my son was younger and he was in school that I looked at his history book and I changed some of the things with pencil because they were wrong. So I'm sure his teacher loved that, but I couldn't have that. So yeah, but I've worn armor, and it's a little uncomfortable, but then again, I'm a plump middle-aged woman, not a strapping 18-year-old man in best of health, wearing something like that and moving, but it can be done.
And I think it's funny too because a lot of people, I think, believe that knights used to ride around on giant horses like Clydesdales, but the Clydesdale wasn't even bred until like the 1800s. So,
No, and a lot of now they did have war horses. They were bigger horses, but they were not anywhere near as big as the horses we have now. The horses have gotten bigger. So whenever they show knights in films, they put them on a percheron or something, and they just weren't that big, those horses. But they were bigger, heavier, stockier. In fact, a knight was, as I said, a very expensive proposition. First, your whole full harness, your armor, probably cost as much as an expensive Armani suit, but you had to have a suite of horses as well. You had to have your destrier, your war horse. You had to have your palfrey, that's for just riding around town, like your Prius, and you had to have baggage horses to carry your armor and the rest of your baggage. And you had a squire, because you couldn't get into your armor without help. So he has a horse. He has baggage horses. I mean, and now we're talking about at least 5 horses. And they're expensive as they were then as they are now. So it was very expensive being a knight.
Oh, I forgot to write down who asked the question, but I think it was Anna asked, what surprised you the most when you immersed yourself in the reality of the Middle Ages?
Surprised me. I think perhaps I just didn't realize how much I should have, but I just didn't realize how important the social strata was. My book series, the Crispin Cast Medieval Noir Mysteries, features a man who was a knight and lord and lost it all because he committed treason. And instead of a very nasty death, he was saved by his mentor, Duke of Lancaster, and was just banished from court and all of his money and wealth and his title and things. So I had to really delve deep into that and how terrible a thing that would have been. I mean, a terrible execution would have been bad enough, but to live, I mean, humiliated as he was, it was a terrible thing. Now, people of that time period, if you were lowly, you couldn't necessarily rise up, but if you were just a little lowly, if you were a merchant class, you could, with certain expectations, become some of the upper class. You could be a knight, for instance. All it took was money and some connections. But, for instance, a woman who was maybe a servant in a household, if she married the master, she's moving up. And if he died, she could marry somebody else even higher. So there was movement in the classes, but somebody like that could never expect to be a true high noble.
Somebody asked, when you had your armor on, did you actually ride a horse? And how was that?
I was on a horse. I did get on. I got on a 2,000-pound percheron.
Awesome.
And that was something else. I'll tell you one thing: when you're in armor, you are not going to sneak up on anyone. It's very noisy. There's a lot of clanking, and getting on a horse. I did need help getting on that horse, but you feel important. I'll tell you that. You are high up there. You're looking down at the people below you. You can really see how people thought of themselves and how all of the trappings really reinforce those ideas.
Mhm. Yeah, I can definitely see that. Like, I think I would get uppity if I had a suit of armor and a horse. I don't know.
I think so. It doesn't. It wouldn't take long, right?
No. What are some of your favorite sources for research, and do you have any that you recommend in particular, like websites or scholars?
Well, I have belonged to the oldest listserv on the internet. It's called Mediv-L. Instead of the AL for medieval, it's -L.
Hmm.
And it's made up of medieval scholars and historians and professors. And they communicate and chat here and there, and I got on there and I did a lot of lurking. Mostly what I asked, I found out real quick that don't ask a stupid question. Do some research first and then ask an intelligent question. Mostly what I asked them is, what books should I research? And I found myself going to university libraries. That was really the best source for the things that I needed. And I was very surprised by the things that I could get at university libraries. My local one here in Southern California, in the Inland Empire, was University of Riverside. And it's just, typical average university. But they have medieval manuscripts. They have stuff that's the real deal that you can handle. And so you can't check it out, but you can be there and touch it. But I also was able to contact people in archives across the pond. So in England, you could talk to people in archives and get some information that way. And early on, before a lot of things were scanned, there's tons more things scanned now, which is great. But you'd contact these archives by email because I knew certain things that I needed were only in these archives, and I just needed, a Xerox or something. But I'm imagining these people in these archives where nobody talks to them. Nobody talked to them. And they get, a ping. They got an email. Oh, look, Gertie, we got an email. They're all excited. Because they were so generous and kind to me. Very often you have to pay for these copies to be done. You pay per copy. But they didn't. They just gave me stuff. They mailed it off to me. I said, do you want me to pay you back? Oh, no. So, I got a lot of stuff that way in the early days. But it's still libraries. It's still going to libraries. Now, you can start with things like Wikipedia, but beware that anybody can change anything on a Wikipedia page. Look at the bibliography. Look at what they have as other sources and start with those things and then go on from there. And as I said about sources, do make sure I can't read Latin or medieval French. So I can't go to the primary sources because I can't read it. So I have to go to secondary and usually tertiary sources, people that wrote about this stuff with a certain amount of qualification. So mostly what I was looking for were the books that had the things that they were qualified to talk about, because some people are, some of your more popular histories that show up on the bestseller list are not always the best. I know one of them was The World Lit Only by Fire. There was a lot of dubious information in those things, but they were written in a way that was easy for people to read, and they became very popular. Don't trust those things. Always go to somebody who knows, so you can get the best information. For instance, there's always medieval things in the news as well. We found Richard III, right? In a parking lot. That was new. But also, speaking of Richard III, years prior to that, they thought Bosworth Field was in one location. That's where Richard III met his end. But they discovered through digging and doing archaeological digs that it actually was like 3 miles over.
Huh.
And they know that because they found a bunch of one of Richard's badges representing him. If you were on his side, you wore a boar. It was boar pins. They found those, and they found something very interesting too. They didn't realize they would find this, but they found small cannonballs. Now, guns were already in use in the late 14th century. They were a pain to use, and you couldn't aim them for toffee. But they had cannons, but they didn't realize that in Richard's time, this is the 1400s, that they used movable artillery like that in these battles. So to find that out sort of changes the scope of the idea of these battles. The horse that he wanted, he was willing to trade his kingdom for, my kingdom for a horse, could have been shot out from under him by cannonball. So if you were an historical novelist and you're writing about Richard III, you would include cannons in your battle scene. So it changes when you learn things.
That's really cool. I actually didn't know that they misplaced the Battle of Bosworth, so that's cool.
Yeah.
I guess these things happen. Somebody was asking if I think it was Jenna actually who joined us. Are there any realistic period shows that you recommend?
Oh boy.
No.
Well, let me just say no, there aren't. But what was I would kind of recommend the Hollow Crown series of Shakespearean plays that the BBC put out when the Olympics was in London. It is, I think it was, I'm trying to think of who, it was Richard II and Henry IV and those several plays together. I think they did an excellent job. Now, it's still Shakespeare, so it's Shakespeare's history, so that's a bit skewed. But I think they do an excellent job in the costumes and just the feel of it. Because every time they do a movie or a TV show, they mess with it too much. And they don't have to. They don't have to change the drama. There was tons of drama, like the Tudors. I could just slap those people. Because Henry VIII is just rife with drama. There's no reason to change any of it. There's no reason to combine characters. It was there. So, and the costumes are always, I always shake my head at them. They're just terrible. I think, probably the only thing I can think of that is fairly accurate is the movie The Lion in Winter. Except for the Christmas tree they have in there. That's wrong. But the rest, it's sort of modern speech, but the sensibilities were there and the costumes were a lot better. So it's not a lot. They should do my books as a series.
Seriously, I would love that.
Seriously.
I'm so thrilled with that. See, Kristen,
I'd be okay with that.
I think a lot of us would be. There was a lot of discussion too about medieval food when you were on that slide. And I think it's just kind of interesting. So have you ever made any authentically medieval food? And if so, what was your favorite dish?
Oh gosh, yes, I have. There's actually a really good dish. It's a cheese pie, which is essentially a cheesecake. And it's really easy to make. And of course I used a blender, the ye old blender. But you could do it the old-fashioned way. It's basically brie with the rind and all, and honey, and there's and you use elderflowers, carnations as flavoring. It's this really fresh, wonderful pie. There's all kinds of other things. My husband's a home brewer, an award-winning home brewer. And I wanted to write an article about medieval ale that I got published in Renaissance magazine. And we made from the bottom up. We made medieval ale from sprouting the grain and drying it and grinding it and cooking it and all that. It wasn't very good. I mean, we might have made a misstep someplace, but medieval ale is actually a little sweeter than what we're used to, and there was no preservatives. Hops does a lot of preserving of beer, but they didn't have hops then, so you had to drink it quick. And they had lots of different herbs that they added too, lots of things that we don't today. So yeah, it's fun. I would recommend. There's a book called, if I can just grab it, To the King's Taste. Richard II's Book of Feasts and Recipes Adapted for Modern Cooking by Lorna J. Sass. And that's got some great recipes in it. It's got the original Middle English recipe first, and then they translate it for you. And it's interesting to see the kinds of spices and things that they used for just everyday cooking.
Well, that's really cool. I'm going to have to look that up. I stumbled across a website a few years ago called Good Cookery.
Yes, that's a good one too.
That one's fun. I've made a couple things, and when I was in England this summer, I had black pudding for the first time. I just thought I would try it, and I'm like, well, I know what's in it, so
yeah,
we'll just go with that.
And it was sausage, everybody who you don't know.
Yes, and it was delicious. I had no idea.
Yeah. So I mean, they were not stupid, and they had really interesting food. And if you wanted to have a really good feast, and it tells you how to do this, you can cook a cockatrice. You can make a cockatrice for dinner, and it's basically an animal that has the front part of a bird and the back part of a four-legged creature. And what you do is, in Middle English, they told you ye take a geese and you take a swine and ye smite them athwart. In other words, you cut off the front part of a goose, you cut off you cut off the back part of a goose, you cut off the front part of a pig, you sew them together and you cook them. And then, you have this strange animal, and then you cover the goose carefully with feathers again, and you serve it. So the next time, hey, Valentine's Day is coming up, guys. You may want to do something special. So, of course, your mate might say, cockatrice again?
Jennifer Romano says it's basically turducken.
Well, except outside.
Yeah.
Not inside.
Funny. Well, we are coming right up to the hour, so if anybody has any other questions, now's your chance. I had too many questions to go through everything, but this was delightful. I had so much fun listening to this, and I will send you, it'll be a few days, but I will send you a link to the recording, Jeri, so that you can use it however you want in the future. Thank you.
Well, I love doing this. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And if you want to learn anything more about my books, just go to jeriwesterson.com.
I will drop that in the chat.
Coming up.
Yeah, I will drop that in the chat box. And also, just while we're all here, I want to remind everyone about the next Brown Bag, which is on March 12th, and it's titled Helping Students Climb Their Way to Success. We'll send out planners for that soon, so keep an eye out for that. And if there's nothing else, I will let everybody have the rest of their day back. And thank you so very much, Jeri. This was wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Everybody have a good day wherever you are.
You too. Bye-bye now.
Bye now.